Nyah's white cane stuttered against the polished marble floor. Tap, tap, pause. 42 steps from the mall's service entrance to the fountain. 12 more to the northeast pillar. Nyah moved with a practiced, counting rhythm, the weight of her 6-month pregnancy shifting her balance in ways that made her steps feel heavier than they used to. She clutched a cardboard tray of 3 steaming coffees in her left hand, her right hand guiding the cane. The air in the atrium changed. It went from the dry, recycled scent of the mall to a sudden wall of expensive sandalwood and cold ozone. She was 2 steps off. She didn't know it, but she was. She collided with something solid, not the unyielding wood of a kiosk, but the firm, warm breadth of a man's chest. The impact sent a jar through her spine, the coffee tray buckled, and she heard the plastic lids pop. A splash of scalding liquid hit fabric. Expensive fabric, the kind that absorbs heat with a soft, heavy thwack rather than a splash. Nearby, a woman gasped, a sharp, sucked-in sound. Behind her, a man muttered something in rapid Korean, his voice tight with sudden aggression. Nyah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I am so sorry, Nyah whispered. She reached into her apron pocket for a napkin, her hand trembling as she aimed for where she thought the spill was. Please, let me. A hand caught her wrist. The grip was massive, encircling her arm completely, but it wasn't rough. It was steady. Firm. He didn't pull her. He simply guided her hand 6 inches to the right so the napkin actually touched the wet wool. You missed, a voice said. It was a low, calm baritone. There was no anger in it, only a chillingly focused curiosity. I'm blind, Nyah said, her voice regaining its edge. I miss a lot of things. She expected him to scoff or walk away. Most people did, but the hand stayed on her wrist. She could feel the heat of him, the sheer power radiating from his stillness. The coffee, he said. Was it any good? Nyah blinked her unfocused eyes. It was a $4 espresso. It wasn't going to change my life. It changed my suit, he replied. There was a beat of silence. I am Seung-Min, and you are going to be late for your shift. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and become part of the Cold Boss Stories family. We'd love to have you here. And don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Nyah didn't go home after the spill. She couldn't afford to. Even with the damp, brownish stain clinging to her peripheral senses and the lingering heat of that stranger's grip on her wrist, she had a shift to finish at the bistro. The mall's air conditioning felt like a physical weight against her skin, mocking the sweat blooming at the small of her back. Every step back to the restaurant was a mental battle. Count the tiles, avoid the strollers, ignore the phantom scent of sandalwood that seemed to have bonded with her uniform. You're late, Nyah, her manager, Miller, barked the moment she stepped through the service door. His voice always sounded like gravel being turned in a dryer, rough, dry, and entirely devoid of empathy. And you look like hell. Is that coffee on your apron? Nyah straightened her shoulders, her hand instinctively resting over the firm swell of her stomach. An accident in the atrium. I'll change into a spare. Don't bother. Just get on the floor. Table 4 is complaining about their water. Nyah navigated the cramped kitchen with the grace of someone who had memorized the location of every jagged corner and slippery tile. She didn't need eyes to feel Miller's gaze on her back, weighing her worth against the liability of her pregnancy and her cane. She was a ghost in this machine, a high-risk asset he was just waiting for a reason to scrap. The next 4 hours were a blur of sensory exhaustion. The clatter of silverware, the high-pitched chirp of credit card machines, and the constant, low-level anxiety of navigating a crowded floor while carrying trays of food she couldn't see. But through it all, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck. It was a sensation she hadn't felt since she lost her sight, the heavy, unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't the casual, pitying glance of a diner noticing her cane. This was different. It was a cold, predatory focus that seemed to follow her from the kitchen pass to the window booths. When the dinner rush finally ebbed into a dull hum, Miller called her over to the register. His voice had changed. The gravel was still there, but it was coated in something oily, something like fear. Nyah, he said, and for the first time in 6 months, he didn't sound like he was about to fire her. A gentleman left this for you, table 7. Nyah frowned. Table 7 was a corner booth, tucked away in the shadows, far from the main traffic. I didn't serve table 7 today. Sarah did. He didn't leave it for Sarah, Miller said, his breath smelling of stale tobacco as he leaned closer. He said it was for the woman who misses a lot of things. He told me to make sure you got it personally. He pressed a slip of paper into her hand. Nyah's fingers traced the texture. It wasn't the thermal paper of a standard receipt. It was thick, heavy cardstock. Beside it, he placed a stack of bills so crisp they felt like blades. How much? Nyah whispered, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. 10,000, Miller breathed. All hundreds. He paid for a black coffee with $1,000 and told me to keep the change if I kept my mouth shut. Then he left that for you. Nyah's breath hitched. $10,000. It was more than she had in her savings. It was more than she would make in a year of doubles. It was rent. It was prenatal vitamins. It was a crib and a car seat and a chance to breathe. But as her fingers brushed the heavy cardstock of the note, the air in the bistro suddenly felt as cold as the atrium floor. She ran her thumb over the paper. There was no ink she could read, but there was an engraving, a raised symbol of a stylized tiger circling a sun. What does the note say, Miller? There was a long pause. She heard Miller swallow hard. It just says, I don't like my debts unpaid. I'll see you tomorrow, Nyah. Nyah's hand snapped back as if the paper had burned her. I'll see you tomorrow. It wasn't a promise. It was a scheduled event. It was a claim. Miller, what did he look like? The man at table 7. He wasn't alone, Miller whispered, his voice shaking. 2 guys at the bar, suits so sharp they could cut you. They didn't eat. They just watched the door and the guy at the table. He never took his eyes off you, not once. He sat there for 3 hours just watching you work. He looked like a man who already owned the building and was just deciding what to do with the furniture. Nyah stuffed the money into her apron, her movements frantic. The security she had felt only moments ago had curdled into a thick, black dread. She grabbed her cane, the wood familiar and grounding in her sweating palm. I'm going home, she said, her voice cracking. Nyah, wait. She didn't wait. She burst through the doors, her cane singing a frantic rhythm against the mall's marble. Tap, tap, tap. She wasn't counting steps anymore. She was running. The mall was closing. The bright, designer displays were being shuttered behind iron gates, the hum of the crowd replaced by a cavernous, haunting silence. Every echo of her own footsteps sounded like a pursuit. Every rustle of a janitor's broom sounded like the slide of a silencer. She reached the bus stop, her chest heaving, the weight of the $10,000 in her pocket feeling like a lead weight. She felt exposed. In the dark, the world was a map of sounds, and right now, the map was screaming. A black sedan idled at the curb, its engine a low, expensive purr that didn't belong in this neighborhood. As the bus finally pulled up, the sedan didn't move. It just sat there, its tinted windows like empty eye sockets, watching her climb the steps. Nyah fumbled for her seat, her hand instinctively shielding her stomach. She realized then that the gentleman from the mall hadn't just given her money. He had stripped away her invisibility. For 3 years, her blindness had been a shield. People looked through her, ignored her, or pitied her. But Seung-Min Yoon had looked at her. He had seen the waitress. He had seen the mother. And most terrifyingly, he had seen a debt that he intended to collect. As the bus pulled away, Nyah leaned her head against the cold glass of the window. She could still feel the phantom pressure on her wrist where he had held her. It wasn't just a tip. It was a down payment. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a target. And as the bus turned the corner, she could still hear. Just barely over the roar of the bus engine, the smooth, persistent purr of the black sedan following her into the night. The radiator in Nyah's apartment hissed like a dying lung, a rhythmic, metallic wheeze that usually helped her sleep. But tonight, the $10,000 sat on her laminate kitchen table, and the weight of the cash felt like a physical presence, a silent witness in the room. She hadn't turned on the lights. She didn't need to, and besides, the darkness was her only remaining ally. She sat in the wooden chair, her hands folded over her stomach, listening to the city. The distant siren of an ambulance, the muffled bass of a neighbor's television. And then, a sound that didn't belong, the heavy, synchronized thud of leather-soled shoes in the hallway. They didn't knock. The door to her apartment groaned as it was pushed open, not kicked, but opened with the casual authority of someone who had already procured the key. Nyah stood up, her hand flying to the hilt of her white cane leaning against the table. "Who's there? I have a phone. I'll call the police." "The police are currently directing traffic 3 blocks away, Nyah. They won't be coming here." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same silken blade from the mall, the same low, resonant baritone that had occupied her thoughts for the last 12 hours. Seung-Min Yoon. Nyah heard the soft click of the door closing. The scent of sandalwood and expensive ozone flooded the small, cramped kitchen, suffocating the smell of her cheap floral detergent. 2 other sets of breathing remained by the door, the bodyguards. But the man himself moved closer. She heard the rustle of his wool coat, the confident, measured stride of a man who didn't need to see the furniture to know he owned the space it occupied. "You followed me," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I ensured you arrived safely," Seung-Min corrected. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. The wood creaked under his weight. "This building is a fire hazard. The lock on your front door was a suggestion, not a barrier. And your neighbor in 4B has a record for aggravated assault. It is not an environment for a woman in your condition." "My condition is none of your business, and neither is my rent. Take your money and go." She pushed the stack of bills toward the center of the table. She heard a soft, dry chuckle. "I don't take back gifts, Nyah, and I don't leave my business unfinished. The coffee you spilled, it was a sign." "It was an accident," she snapped. "I'm blind, remember." "Precisely." She heard him lean forward, the table groaning under his elbows. "You are blind to the light, but you are not blind to the truth. In the mall, when my men reached for their weapons, you didn't flinch. You didn't beg. You protected your child and you waited for the strike. You have a stillness that my world lacks. You hear things others miss. You feel the shift in a room before the air even moves." Nyah gripped her cane tighter. "What do you want from me?" "I want to hire you," he said. The words were clinical, stripped of the predatory heat she had felt earlier. "I have a conglomerate with interests that span several continents. My associates are men who have spent their lives learning how to lie with their eyes and their smiles. But they cannot lie to a woman who navigates the world through the vibration of a voice." "You want a human lie detector." "I want a consultant," Seung-Min replied smoothly. "You will sit in my meetings. You will listen to the cadence of their breath, the tension in their throats, the way their heartbeats skip when I mention certain numbers. You will be my ears. In return, I provide a salary that makes that $10,000 look like pocket change. I provide a private residence with 24-hour medical staff for your pregnancy, and I provide security." Nyah let out a hollow laugh. "Security from who? You. You're the one who broke into my house." "Security from the world that let you walk into a man like me because your sister was too busy on her phone to guide you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are struggling, Nyah. You are 6 months pregnant, working double shifts on a marble floor that is destroying your back, living in a slum where the elevator hasn't worked since 2019. How long do you think you can keep the child if you stay here?" The question hit her like a physical blow. It was her deepest fear, the one she kept locked away in the quietest hours of the night. The state, the lack of resources, the sheer impossibility of raising a child in the dark without a safety net. "Why me?" she asked, her voice small. "There are 1,000 people you could hire. Why go to this much trouble for a waitress?" There was a long silence. She heard him stand up, his presence looming over her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. "Because everyone else looks at me and sees a monster or a bank account," he whispered. "You looked at me and saw a ruined shirt. You spoke to me as if I were a man, not a god. I found that refreshing." He reached into his pocket and placed a single sheet of paper on top of the money. "This is a contract. It outlines your duties, your compensation, and your living arrangements. I have a car waiting downstairs." My men will pack your things. You have 5 minutes to decide if you want to keep fighting a war you've already lost, or if you want to come inside where it's warm." Nyah reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy paper. It was a business arrangement. That's what he was calling it. But she could hear the unspoken subtext in the rhythm of his breathing. He wasn't looking for an employee. He was looking for a centerpiece. He was building a cage, and he was plating it in gold. She thought of the cold walk to the bus stop. She thought of Miller's gravelly voice and the damp stain on her apron. Then she thought of the baby, the tiny, fluttering life that deserved more than a radiator that hissed like a dying lung. "I won't be a prisoner," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "You will be a consultant," Seung-Min repeated, though the possessive edge was back in his tone. "The car is waiting, Nyah. Don't make me wait with it." He turned and walked toward the door, his bodyguard stepping aside with a synchronized rustle of fabric. Nyah stood alone in the center of her dark kitchen, the silence of the apartment suddenly feeling more dangerous than the man who had just left it. She reached for her cane. She didn't have much to pack. Everything she truly owned was already inside her, or held in the palm of her hand. She walked toward the door, her cane tapping against the linoleum, each strike sounding like a gavel bringing her old life to a close. She was stepping into the den of a lion, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't walking alone. The penthouse of the Yoon estate didn't smell like a home. It smelled like an art gallery, all cold marble, expensive floor wax, and the hushed, pressurized silence of high-altitude wealth. Nyah's feet, encased in soft cashmere slippers that had appeared by her bedside like a magic trick, felt alien on the heated floors. For 3 days, she had moved through this glass fortress like a ghost, mapping the layout with her cane and the echo of her own breath. She knew the distance from the velvet sofa to the floor-to-ceiling windows was 24 steps. She knew the kitchen island was carved from a single, jagged piece of granite. And she knew that Seung-Min was always nearby, a silent, predatory warmth that shadowed her every move. On the 4th morning, the silence was broken not by a bodyguard, but by the man himself. "The car is downstairs, Nyah. We're going to the clinic." Nyah paused, her hand frozen on the edge of a crystal vase. "I told you, I have an appointment at the community center next week. I can take the bus." "The community center is a warehouse for the neglected," Seung-Min's voice drifted from across the room, closer than she had anticipated. "You are no longer neglected. You are under my care. Dr. Aris is the best prenatal specialist in the state. He is waiting." Nyah tightened her grip on her cane. "You're treating me like a project, Seung-Min, or a piece of property." "I am treating you like a necessity," he countered. She heard the soft rustle of his silk tie being adjusted. "And property doesn't have a heartbeat. Your child does. I intend to hear it." The drive was a blur of smooth turns and the scent of the car's leather interior. When they arrived at the private clinic, there were no crowded waiting rooms or the smell of industrial bleach. Instead, there was the soft chime of a bell and the hushed tones of a receptionist who spoke to Seung-Min with the kind of terrified reverence Nyah was beginning to recognize as his natural habitat. In the examination room, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender. Nyah sat on the edge of the table, the crinkle of the sanitary paper beneath her sounding like thunder in the quiet space. She felt exposed, her blue waitress uniform replaced by a soft maternity tunic that cost more than her old apartment's rent. "Lie back, Ms. Whitmore," Dr. Aris said, his voice a practiced, professional hum. "Mr. Yoon, you can stand here." Nyah felt the cold shock of the ultrasound gel on her abdomen. She reached out, her fingers searching for the edge of the table, but they found something else. A hand. Large, warm, and calloused. Seung-Min didn't pull away. He let her fingers curl around his knuckles, his grip steadying her as the doctor moved the transducer. For a moment, there was only the static of the machine. Then, the room was suddenly filled with a sound that drowned out the silence of the Yoon Empire. Some thump, some thump, some thump. It was fast, rhythmic, and fiercely alive. It sounded like a drum in a deep cave, a gallop across an open field. It was the sound of a future that Nyah had spent months fearing would be taken from her. Nyah felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye. She squeezed Seung-Min's hand, her nails digging into his skin, and for the first time since the coffee spill, she forgot who he was. She forgot the bodyguards, the black sedans, and the blood that she knew stained his history. In this dark, sensory world, there was only the heartbeat. Beside her, Seung-Min went perfectly still. Nyah couldn't see his face, but she could feel the shift in his breathing. It hitched, a small, jagged break in his usual mechanical composure. His hand, which usually felt like an immovable object, trembled almost imperceptibly against hers. "Is that?" Seung-Min's voice was a ghost of itself. The monster of the North End sounded breathless, his usual armor of calculated indifference pierced by a sound no larger than a whisper. "That's the heart," the doctor said. "Strong, 140 beats per minute, everything looks perfect." Seung-Min didn't speak for a long time. The rhythmic thumping continued to fill the room, a defiant pulse against the coldness of their reality. Nyah felt him lean in closer. She could smell the sandalwood on his coat, feel the radiating heat of his body. He was no longer the man who had broken into her kitchen. He was a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't control. "It sounds like a war drum," Seung-Min whispered, and for once, the violence in his words was replaced by a raw, terrifying awe. He reached out his free hand. Nyah felt the ghost of his touch over her stomach, hesitant and light, as if he were afraid his power might bruise the fragile life beneath. When his palm finally made contact, it was like a circuit had been completed. In that moment, the darkness of Nyah's world felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She realized that Seung-Min wasn't just obsessed with her, he was hungry for the humanity she represented. He was a man who had built a kingdom of shadows, and he had just heard the first note of a song he didn't know how to sing. "He will have everything," Seung-Min said, his voice regaining its depth, though it was now thick with an edge of possessiveness that made Nyah's skin prickle. "He will never know a day of hunger. He will never know a day of fear. I will build a world around him that no one can touch." Nyah pulled her hand back slowly, the spell breaking. "And what about me, Seung-Min? Am I just the vessel for your new world?" Seung-Min stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. The clinical distance returned to his posture, but the warmth of his hand remained on her skin like a brand. "You are the woman who brought me into the dark," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I don't think I want to find the light again without you." As the doctor wiped the gel from her stomach, Nyah felt the familiar weight of the gold-plated cage closing in. Seung-Min had felt the spark of life, but in a man like him, that spark didn't just bring warmth, it brought the need to protect, to own, and to destroy anything that threatened it. The heartbeat was strong, but as they walked back to the car, Nyah realized the real war was only just beginning. The scent of rain and wet slate hung heavy over the Yoon estate that evening, a sharp contrast to the sterile warmth of the clinic where Nyah had heard the pulse of her child. She sat in the library, the high-backed leather chair swallowing her small frame. She didn't need eyes to know the room was oppressive. The silence here was different from the penthouse. It was an ancient silence, thick with the dust of old secrets and the cold weight of a legacy she was only beginning to understand. From the hallway, a rhythmic, heavy thud echoed, the sound of several men walking in unison. It wasn't the light, protective step of the guards Seung-Min had assigned to her. These footsteps were weighted with seniority and a lethal, unhurried arrogance. "Nyah," Seung-Min's voice cut through the gloom, but it lacked its usual silken edge. It was flat, metallic. "Go to the upper study, now." "Who is here, Seung-Min?" Nyah stood, her hand finding the cool silver head of her cane. She could hear the elevation in her own heartbeat, a frantic mirror to the calm rhythm she had heard in the doctor's office. "The council," he replied. The word sounded like a sentence. "Do not come out until I fetch you." Nyah didn't argue. She moved, counting her steps with a precision born of rising fear. But as she reached the balcony of the upper study, which overlooked the grand drawing room, she stopped. The acoustics of the old mansion were a gift and a curse. Every whisper from below rose to her like smoke. She heard the heavy creak of the front doors. Then, the voice of an older man, raspy, seasoned by decades of smoke and command. It was Elder Kang, the man who had supposedly mentored Seung-Min's father. "You are late, Seung-Min," Kang said, his voice a dry rattle. "And you smell of baby powder and cheap perfume. It is beneath the chairman of the Yoon syndicate." "My time is my own, Elder," Seung-Min replied. Nyah could hear him pouring a drink. The clink of ice against crystal was a sharp, lonely sound in the cavernous room. "Your time belongs to the bloodline," a second voice added, sharper and more impatient. This was Director O, the man in charge of the syndicate's ports. "The Han family is moving into the docks. They see you distracted. They see you playing house with a waitress, a blind girl who carries a child that has no place in our records." Nyah's hand tightened on the balcony railing. The wood felt cold, like ice. "The girl is a consultant," Seung-Min said, his tone dangerously light. "And the child is protected." "The child is a liability," Kang barked, the sound of his cane striking the floorboards echoing like a gunshot. "A leader cannot have a soft underbelly, Seung-Min. We have watched you buy her silence with gold and medicine. We have watched you pull guards from the perimeter to watch a woman sleep. It ends tonight. Dispose of the distraction. Give her a settlement, send her to the countryside, and let the child be born where it cannot be used as leverage, or we will do it for you." The silence that followed was absolute. Nyah held her breath, her chest aching. She expected Seung-Min to bargain. She expected him to explain his business arrangement again. Instead, she heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. Seung-Min was moving toward someone. "Director O," Seung-Min said, his voice dropping to a whisper that Nyah could only hear because of the room's unique architecture. "You were the one who suggested the Han family was watching, yes?" I am only reporting the rumors, Chairman," O replied, his voice suddenly losing its sharp edge. "And you were the one who authorized the surveillance on my private clinic yesterday, the one who thought he could track my movements through a pregnant woman's ultrasound. It was for your safety." The sound that followed was wet and sudden, a choked, gargling gasp that broke the silence of the library. Nyah's hand flew to her mouth. She heard the heavy thump of a body hitting the floor, followed by the frantic, terrified scuffle of chairs as the other elders scrambled back. "Safety is a luxury you no longer possess, Director," Seung-Min said. Nyah could hear him wiping something, likely a blade, with a silk handkerchief. The sound of the fabric sliding over steel was a soft, rhythmic hiss. "Seung-Min," Kang's voice was trembling now. "He was a director. You cannot execute a member of the council over a..." "Over what?" Seung-Min's voice was no longer flat. It was a roar of controlled fury. "Over my family. You speak of bloodlines, Elder, yet you forget whose blood runs through these halls. I am the Yoon syndicate. And let me be clear so there is no further confusion among the survivors. Nyah Whitmore is not a distraction. She is the crown. The child she carries is the heir. If any of you so much as breathes the same air she does without my permission, I will not stop at a single execution. I will erase your names from the history of this city." Nyah felt the floor beneath her sway. The monster she had heard stories about wasn't a myth. He was downstairs, standing over a dead man, claiming her unborn baby as a prince of a shadow empire. She heard the heavy doors open again. The elders were fleeing. The silence that returned was heavy, smelling of iron and expensive scotch. Moments later, she heard the footsteps on the stairs. They were slower now, heavier. When the door to the study opened, Nyah didn't move. She stood by the railing, her sightless eyes facing the direction of his heat. "You shouldn't have listened," Seung-Min said. He sounded tired, but the possessive edge remained. "You killed him," Nyah whispered. "In front of them for me." "I killed him for us," he corrected. He moved into her space, his hands finding her waist. They were cold but steady. "They needed to understand that you are not a guest in this house, Nyah. You are the house." Nyah leaned her head against his chest, her ear pressing against the fine wool of his suit. Underneath, his heart was beating with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who had just stained her world with blood to keep it quiet. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked. "Neither will I," he replied, his lips brushing the top of her head. "Sleep now, Nyah, the world is quiet again." But as he led her back toward her bedroom, Nyah realized the quiet was a lie. The war hadn't ended. It had simply moved from the docks to her doorstep. The morning air inside the Yoon estate was always the same, perfectly filtered, climate-controlled, and smelling of nothing at all. Nyah woke to the soft, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation, a sound that had once been soothing, but now felt like the low thrum of a machine keeping her on life support. She sat up, her hand instinctively finding the silver-headed cane leaning against her nightstand. Today, the silk sheets felt like spider webs. She decided to test the boundaries. She had spent a week mapping the interior, but she had never tried to cross the threshold of the grand foyer without an escort. Nyah dressed in a simple maternity dress, her movements efficient and quiet. She didn't call for the maid. She didn't wait for the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the guards. She simply walked. Tap, tap, tap. The marble was cold. She counted the steps, 54 to the elevators, 38 through the gallery. She reached the massive mahogany doors of the main entrance, her fingers trailing along the intricate carvings. She reached for the handle, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The door didn't budge. Ms. Whitmore. The voice didn't belong to Seung-Min. It was deeper, gravelly, and entirely immovable. It was Sang-ho, the lead head of security. "I'd like to go for a walk," Nyah said, her voice steady despite the prickle of fear on her neck. "The park across the street. I need fresh air." "The air in the garden is filtered, ma'am. Mr. Yoon has requested that you remain inside the perimeter for your safety. Recent events have made the street unpredictable." "The streets haven't changed, Sang-ho. Only the man who thinks he owns them has." Nyah turned, her cane striking the floor with a sharp, defiant crack. "Open the door." "I cannot do that." Nyah felt the walls of the estate begin to shrink. The gold-plated cage was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical reality. She wasn't a guest or a consultant. She was a high-value asset under lock and key. She turned and marched toward the back of the house, toward the scent of sandalwood and the low, resonant vibration of Seung-Min's voice. She found him in the library, the very room where the blood had been spilled only nights before. The air still carried the faint, metallic tang of iron, though the floors had been scrubbed until they shone. "Open the doors, Seung-Min," she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. She heard the soft slide of a fountain pen against paper. "You should be resting, Nyah. The doctor said your blood pressure was slightly elevated." "My blood pressure is elevated because I'm living in a fortress. I tried to leave. Your man stopped me." "He did his job," Seung-Min replied. She heard him stand, the slow, deliberate rustle of his suit jacket signaling his full attention. "The world outside those doors is no longer the one you remember. After what happened with the council, you are a target. Every rival syndicate, every ambitious underling sees you as a way to get to me." "Then let them." Nyah stepped closer, her sightless eyes fixed on the direction of his heat. "I survived 3 years on my own in this city. I survived being blind and pregnant and broke. I didn't ask for your protection, and I certainly didn't ask to be your prisoner." "You asked for a life for your child," Seung-Min said, his voice dropping to that dangerous velvet low. "I am providing it. In this house he is safe. In this house you have everything. Why is that not enough?" "Because I don't have myself," Nyah shouted, the sound echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "You bought my debt, you bought my time, and now you're trying to buy my will. You think because you put me in silk and feed me off silver that I'll forget who you are. You're a man who executes people over scotch, Seung-Min. You're a monster who thinks love is just another word for possession." The silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate. She heard him move, a predatory, blurring speed that ended with him inches from her face. She could smell the dark roast of his coffee and the cold ozone that always seemed to cling to him. He didn't touch her, but the air between them was charged with a terrifying, electric tension. "Do not mistake my restraint for weakness, Nyah," he whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. "I could have let the Han family take you. I could have let the council dispose of the distraction. Instead, I turned my back on my own elders. I stained my hands to keep yours clean. You call this a prison. I call it a sanctuary. And as long as my heart beats, you will stay behind these glass walls because the alternative is your grave. Nyah's hand flew up, her palm connecting with his cheek in a sharp, stinging slap. The sound was like a whip crack in the quiet library. She froze, her fingers tingling from the impact. She expected a strike back. She expected the monster to roar. Instead, she felt his hand wrap slowly around her wrist. His grip was iron, but it didn't crush. He pulled her hand back to his face, pressing her palm against the skin she had just struck. "Is that all you have?" he asked, his voice raw and jagged. "Hit me again, hate me if you must, but you will not leave. You are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale, Nyah, and I will burn every block of it to the ground before I let anyone take you from me." Nyah felt a sob catch in her throat. She realized then that the argument wasn't about her freedom, it was about his fear. The most powerful man in the city was terrified of the dark, and she was the only light he had left. She pulled her hand away, her fingers trembling. "You aren't protecting me, Seung-Min. You're hiding me. Because you know that the moment I walk out those doors, you have to face the world you created. A world where everything you love is a target." She turned and walked away, the rhythm of her cane sounding hollow against the marble. Seung-Min didn't follow her. He stood in the center of the library, a king in a fortress of his own making, realizing for the first time that while he could lock the doors, he couldn't keep her heart from escaping through the cracks. As she reached the safety of her room, Nyah leaned against the door, her hand resting on her stomach. The baby kicked, a sharp, sudden movement that felt like a warning. The glass walls were thick, but Nyah knew that even the strongest fortress eventually falls from the inside. The transition from the clinical stillness of the estate to the sensory chaos of the city was like stepping into a furnace. Seung-Min had finally relented, allowing Nyah a supervised visit to a private botanical conservatory, a compromise intended to soothe the mounting friction between them. The air inside the glass dome was thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. For Nyah, it was a reprieve from the sterile ozone of the penthouse, a chance to feel the sun on her skin without a pane of bulletproof glass filtering the warmth. Seung-Min walked half a step behind her, his presence a constant, low-frequency hum. He didn't lead her by the hand. Instead, he used his voice like a tether. 6 steps forward, Nyah. There is a stone bench to your left. The ferns are brushing your shoulder." She moved with a rare sense of ease, her cane tapping softly against the moss-covered gravel. "It smells like life in here," she whispered, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach. "Not like a museum." "Life is messy, Nyah. I prefer the museum," Seung-Min replied, though there was a rare, microscopic trace of a smile in his tone. The piece lasted exactly 12 minutes. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a sanctuary, the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of heavy boots on the ceramic tile of the entryway. Then, the shattering of glass. Not the soft tinkle of a fallen vase, but the violent, pressurized explosion of the conservatory's high windows. "Down!" Seung-Min's voice lost its velvet. It became a command of pure iron. Before Nyah could process the scream of the wind rushing through the broken glass, she felt his weight slam into her. He didn't just push her, he shielded her, his large frame wrapping around her like a living suit of armor as they hit the damp earth behind a heavy stone planter. The air was suddenly filled with the terrifying, staccato thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. Nyah's world, already dark, became a nightmare of sound and vibration. She felt the planter vibrate as bullets chipped away at the granite. She heard the wet, heavy thud of a body falling nearby, one of the guards. "Seung-Min," she cried out, her fingers clutching his lapel. The scent of sandalwood was now spiked with the acrid sting of gunpowder. "Stay small, Nyah, stay against the stone," he hissed. He was moving, his hands tactile and frantic as he checked her for injuries. "Listen to only me. Do you hear me? Ignore the glass, ignore the screaming, follow my voice or we die." "I can't see where they are." "I am your eyes," he growled. He pulled her up, keeping his body between her and the entrance. The conservatory, once a paradise, was now a kill zone of echoes. Nyah's cane was gone, lost in the initial fall. She felt a wave of cold, paralyzing terror. Without her cane, she was anchored to the spot, a blind target in a storm of lead. 3 o'clock, 10 steps, Seung-Min commanded, his voice tight. He was firing back now, the deafening cracks of his handgun vibrating through her very bones. Run, Nyah, now. She ran. She didn't count steps. She trusted the direction of his shout. She felt the wind of a bullet pass her ear, followed by the shattering of a ceramic pot inches from her hip. Stop, drop. She threw herself down, her hands scraping against the gravel. A burst of gunfire raked the air exactly where her head had been a second before. To your left 5 steps. There is a doorway. Move. Nyah scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in jagged, sobbing gasps. She could hear the Han Syndicate soldiers moving, the rustle of tactical gear, the harsh shouts in Korean. They were closing in. Seung-Min was the only thing standing between her unborn child and a dozen barrels. She reached the doorway, her hands fumbling for the frame. Seung-Min was right behind her, his breathing heavy and labored. He shoved her into a narrow maintenance corridor, slamming the heavy steel door and bolting it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of her heart. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands raking over her shoulders, her belly, her legs. He was trembling, not from fear, but from a feral, concentrated adrenaline. "I'm fine, I think I'm fine," she wheezed, her hands finding his face. Her fingers came away wet, not with tears. "You're bleeding." "It's a graze, it doesn't matter." He leaned his forehead against hers, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "They found us. They knew the route. Someone in my inner circle is dead before the sun goes down." "We have to get out of here," Nyah whispered, her hand trembling against his cheek. "We will, but the rules have changed, Nyah." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to face the direction of his voice. The possessiveness she had hated in the library was now the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "The glass walls didn't work. From this moment on, you don't move unless I breathe. You don't eat unless I taste it. The Han family just tried to take the only thing I value. Now they will learn why the world calls me a monster." Nyah didn't pull away this time. The terror of the ambush had stripped away her defiance, leaving only the raw, primal instinct to survive. In the dark of the maintenance hall, she realized that she was no longer just a consultant or a waitress. She was the center of a war. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Seung-Min picked her up, cradling her and her unborn child against his chest. He walked out of the service exit into the pouring rain, his face a mask of cold, murderous intent. Nyah buried her face in his neck, the scent of rain, blood, and sandalwood marking the end of her innocence. The sanctuary was gone. The fortress had failed. And as Seung-Min stepped into the waiting armored car, Nyah knew that the man holding her was no longer just her protector. He was the only world she had left. The aftermath of the conservatory ambush left the penthouse smelling of scorched gunpowder and medicinal alcohol. Seung-Min had become a frantic shadow, his presence packing the perimeter of Nyah's vision, his voice a constant, low-frequency hum of orders and threats. He had doubled the guards, replaced the glass with reinforced polymer, and refused to let Nyah move from the velvet sofa without his hand on her elbow. But while the physical walls had thickened, the structural integrity of Nyah's trust was beginning to groan under a weight she couldn't identify. It was a Tuesday, 3 days after the rain had washed the blood from the conservatory tiles, when the silence of the estate finally spoke. Seung-Min was in an emergency meeting in the downstairs war room. Nyah, restless and feeling the heavy, rhythmic kick of the baby against her ribs, navigated the hallway toward the study. She wasn't looking for a way out anymore. She was looking for her cane, which had been replaced by a new, custom-weighted carbon fiber model she still hadn't fully mastered. She heard a drawer slide open in the small office adjacent to the library. A soft, rhythmic rustle of paper followed. It wasn't Seung-Min's gait, it was Sang-ho, the security chief, his movements hurried and uncharacteristically clumsy. "Sang-ho," Nyah asked, her voice tilting upward. The rustling stopped instantly. "Ms. Whitmore, you should be in the living area. The chairman is." "The chairman is busy," Nyah interrupted, her hand finding the doorframe. "I heard a sound. Is everything all right?" Just filing the incident reports from the Han attack, Sang-ho said, but his heart was hammering. Nyah could hear it, a frantic, uneven skip in his chest that contradicted his steady tone. Nothing for you to worry about. You're lying, Sang-ho. I can hear the air catching in your throat. Nyah stepped into the room, her sightless eyes fixed on the direction of his breathing. What are you hiding? Nyah, please, go back to your room. Is it about the leak? Did you find who told the Han syndicate where we were? Sang-ho let out a heavy, defeated sigh. The leak wasn't a person, Nyah. It was a ghost. We were looking through the old personnel files, trying to find a connection to the Han family. We found one, but it wasn't what we expected. Nyah felt a cold prickle of dread. What does that mean? The father of your child, Sang-ho whispered, his voice cracking. Marcus Vance, you told us he disappeared. You told us he left you 3 months before the accident. He did, Nyah said, her hand dropping to her stomach. He walked out of the apartment and never came back. I thought he just couldn't handle the pregnancy, or my sight failing. He didn't walk out, Nyah. He was extracted. Sang-ho moved closer, the scent of his anxiety sharp and bitter. Marcus was an undercover associate for the Yoon syndicate. He was a runner for the docks. He was caught skimming off the Han shipments, using the money to pay for your specialist appointments, we think. Nyah's world tilted. The floor felt like it was dissolving beneath her cashmere slippers. Skimming? Marcus wasn't a criminal. He worked in logistics. Logistics for us, Sang-ho corrected. He was a thief, Nyah, and in this world there is only one penalty for theft. The chairman, Seung-min, he signed the order himself, 6 months ago, the same night Marcus disappeared. The air in the room became a vacuum. Nyah's lungs burned, refusing to take in the scent of the sandalwood and ozone that had become her sanctuary. The monster hadn't just found her in a mall. He had been the architect of the void she was living in. He killed him, Nyah whispered, the words tasting like ash. Seung-min executed the father of my baby. He didn't know about you then, Sang-ho said quickly, his voice desperate. He didn't know Marcus had a woman. He didn't know about the child until he saw you in the mall. That's why he's been so obsessed. It wasn't just fascination, Nyah. It was atonement. Atonement? Nyah let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. He turned my life into a graveyard and then built a palace over the bodies. He didn't hire me because I'm special. He hired me because I'm a debt he's trying to pay off in silk and silver. The door to the office slammed open. The air pressure changed instantly. Seung-min had arrived. Sang-ho, out, now. The command was a low, vibrating growl that made the glass decanters on the desk rattle. Nyah heard the security chief scramble past her, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a guillotine. She stood in the center of the room, her sightless eyes wide, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip her stomach to keep them still. Is it true? She asked, her voice a ghost of itself. Seung-min didn't answer immediately. She heard his breathing, slow, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm. He moved toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. I did what was necessary for the syndicate, he said. There was no apology in his tone, only a chilling, practical weight. Marcus Vance was a traitor. He stole from the Yoon bloodline. The law is absolute. And the baby, Nyah cried out, her voice breaking. Was the baby a traitor too? You took his father. You left me in the dark, starving and terrified, and then you had the audacity to play the hero. You didn't find me, Seung-min. You hunted me down to fix your conscience. I didn't know, Nyah, he said, his voice dropping to that velvet low, but this time it felt like a shroud. He reached out, his hand finding her shoulder. Nyah flinched as if he had burned her. Don't touch me, your hands. They're covered in him. Every piece of bread you gave me, every doctor you paid for, it's all blood money. You aren't my protector. You're my jailer. You're the reason I was alone in the first place. I am the reason you are still alive, Seung-min roared, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls. The Han family killed Marcus's entire crew. If I hadn't found you, if I hadn't brought you here, they would have butchered you and that child months ago just to send me a message. I saved you from the consequences of his mistakes. You saved me for yourself, Nyah screamed back. You didn't give me a choice. You lied to me every single day. Every time you felt this baby kick, you knew you were the one who made sure he'd never meet his father. You're not a man, Seung-Min. You're a hollow, gilded cage. She turned, her hand searching for the wall, her movements frantic and clumsy. She needed to leave. She needed the cold, honest wind of the street, the hunger, the fear, anything but the suffocating lie of his protection. You are staying, Nyah, Seung-Min said, his voice dropping back to that calm, terrifying iron. Hate me, curse my name, but you are carrying the only thing left of a debt I intend to see paid. You will stay in this house, and you will give birth to that child, and you will never speak his name again. Nyah stopped, her back to him. The glass walls hadn't just failed, they had shattered, and the shards were buried deep in her heart. The trust was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I'm not a consultant anymore, am I? She whispered. No, Seung-Min replied, his voice right behind her ear, his breath ghosting over her skin. You're a Yoon now, and Yoons do not leave. Nyah closed her eyes, though it changed nothing. In the dark, she realized that the monster hadn't just protected her from the world. He had devoured her whole. The storm didn't break from the sky. It broke from the perimeter. Nyah was huddled in the armchair of the master's suite, her hands white-knuckled as they gripped the velvet upholstery. The air in the penthouse had turned thick and electric, vibrating with a frequency that made her teeth ache. It wasn't just the tension of her shattered trust with Seung-Min. It was the biological clock inside her body finally striking midnight. A sharp, rhythmic tightening had begun in the small of her back an hour ago, a dull ache that had rapidly sharpened into a searing, white-hot band of pressure. Seung-Min, she gasped, her voice barely a thread. She didn't need to see him to know he was there. The scent of sandalwood and cold sweat preceded him as he knelt at her feet. The contractions are 4 minutes apart, Nyah. The medical team is ready in the East Wing. We're moving you now. I can't move, she whispered, a sob catching in her throat as another wave of pain crested. Before he could answer, the world exploded. A dull, distant thrum was followed by the shattering of the reinforced polymer windows in the gallery. The pressurized seal of the penthouse failed with a violent hiss, and the quiet, controlled environment was instantly replaced by the roar of the wind and the staccato crack-crack-crack of high-caliber rifles. They're through the gates, Sang-ho's voice barked over the intercom, drowned out by the scream of a security siren. Chairman, the Han Syndicate has breached the elevator lobby. They're coming up the service shaft. Seung-Min didn't hesitate. He scooped Nyah into his arms, his movements a blurring, desperate efficiency. He didn't look like a boss anymore. He looked like a man possessed by a single, narrow purpose. He ignored the tactical chatter on his earpiece, ignored the sounds of glass raining down in the hallway. Listen to me, Nyah, he hissed, his breath hot against her ear as he ran. The elevator is compromised. We have to take the internal corridor to the medical wing. It's reinforced. It's the only way. Nyah buried her face in his neck, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his suit, the same fabric she had ruined with coffee all those months ago. Another contraction tore through her, a jagged blade of pain that made her scream. Don't stop, she wheezed. Seung-Min, the baby, he's coming. He is coming into a world I have cleared for him, Seung-Min growled. He reached the heavy steel doors of the east corridor and set her down behind a marble pillar. The hallway ahead was a long, narrow kill zone of white light and shadow. At the far end lay the medical suite, a sanctuary of sterile safety. Between them and the door, the first of the Han soldiers emerged from the stairwell. Sang-ho, take her, Seung-Min commanded, shoving Nyah toward the security chief who had appeared from the shadows. Get her behind the secondary seal. Do not open it until I give the code. Chairman, there are too many of them. Go, Seung-Min roared. Nyah felt Sang-ho's rough hands pull her away. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air where Seung-Min had just been. Seung-Min, don't leave me in the dark. I am the dark, Nyah, he shouted back over the deafening roar of a flashbang detonating in the lobby. Now run. The next 10 minutes were a nightmare of sensory overload. Nyah was dragged through the hallway, her legs feeling like lead, her body betraying her with every agonizing contraction. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Seung-Min's handgun, the clinical, rhythmic precision of a man who moved like a machine. She heard him grunt, a wet, heavy sound. The scent of blood, metallic and sharp, began to overpower the lavender of the hallway. "He's hit," she screamed, her sightless eyes wide with a terror she couldn't name. Despite the lies, despite the blood of Marcus Vance that stained his hands, the thought of the silence that would follow Seung-Min's death was a vacuum she couldn't breathe in. "He's still standing, ma'am," Sang-ho wheezed, heaving her through the final set of doors. "He's holding the line." Through the heavy, soundproofed glass of the medical wing's inner seal, Nyah could still hear the war. It was a symphony of violence, the grunt of hand-to-hand combat, the splintering of wood, the heavy, deliberate fire of a man who refused to yield an inch of ground. Seung-Min was a one-man siege, a monster unleashed to protect the only thing he had ever managed to love without a price tag. Nyah fell onto the birthing bed, the lights of the medical suite a blur she could only sense as a dull hum against her eyelids. The doctors swarmed her, their voices a frantic, professional counterpoint to the carnage outside the door. "You have to push, Nyah," a nurse urged. "Now." Nyah gripped the rails of the bed. Outside, she heard the final, desperate surge of the hand soldiers. A chorus of shouts, followed by the absolute, bone-chilling silence of a room where only one man was left breathing. A heavy thud hit the door of the medical suite. Not a breach, but a weight leaning against it. "Seung-Min," Nyah cried out, her voice breaking as the final wave of labor took hold of her. "I'm here," a voice replied through the intercom. It was ragged, punctuated by a wet cough, but it was still iron. "The hallway is clear, Nyah. No one is coming through." Nyah let out a primal, gut-wrenching scream, pouring every ounce of her fear, her anger, and her desperate hope into one final movement. The world went quiet. Then a new sound pierced the silence of the penthouse. It wasn't the crack of a gun or the shatter of glass. It was a thin, high-pitched wail, a delicate, fierce announcement of life in the middle of a graveyard. Nyah fell back against the pillows, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The nurse placed a warm, heavy weight on her chest. Nyah's hands, trembling and slick with sweat, found the soft, velvety skin of her son. He was perfect. He was loud. He was alive. "He's here," she whispered, her tears falling onto the baby's forehead. On the other side of the door, she heard a soft, sliding sound. Seung-Min sinking to the floor, his back against the steel, his duty finally done. "I hear him," Seung-Min whispered through the speaker, his voice a fatting ember. "He sounds like a king." The siege was over, but as the sirens of the Yoon reinforcements finally flooded the building, Nyah realized the fortress hadn't just protected them. It had been the crucible that forged something new. The hospital wing of the estate was a tomb of white light and the rhythmic, artificial sigh of a ventilator. The air was no longer thick with the scent of gunpowder. It had been scrubbed clean, replaced by the sharp, clinical sting of antiseptic, and the soft, milky fragrance of the newborn wrapped in Nyah's arms. The infant was a heavy, warm anchor against her chest, his tiny breaths a frantic, miraculous contrast to the silence of the man behind the reinforced glass. Nyah didn't need to see the monitors to know Seung-Min was alive. She could hear the slow, mechanical beep-beep-beep of his heart, a sound that had once been an iron drum in a hallway of death, now reduced to a fragile electronic pulse. He had taken 3 bullets to keep that hallway clear. He had bled out against the steel door while she brought his heir into the world, a silent sentry who had refused to fall until the first cry of the baby signaled his release. On the 3rd day, the door to the intensive care suite hissed open. Nyah felt the shift in the room's pressure before she heard the footsteps. They were uneven, a slow and agonizing shuffle that lacked the predatory grace she had once feared. "Nyah." His voice was a ghost of its former self, threaded with pain, raspy from the intubation, yet still carrying that unmistakable silken gravity. Nyah sat up in the high-backed chair, her fingers tracing the soft velvet of her son's blanket. "You shouldn't be walking, Seung-Min. Sang-ho said the surgery was extensive." "Sang-ho talks too much," Seung-Min whispered. She heard him sink to his knees beside her chair. It wasn't the fluid movement of a man playing a part. It was the heavy, literal collapse of a king surrendering his throne. He didn't reach for her. He didn't demand her attention. He simply knelt in the dark of her world, his forehead resting against the arm of her chair. "I am a hollow man, Nyah," he said, the words jagged and raw. "I built a fortress to keep you, and I ended up trapping myself in the rubble. I lied about Marcus. I stole your grief and tried to buy your heart with the spoils of a war you never asked for. I thought if I owned the city, I could protect the only thing in it that was pure. I was wrong." Nyah reached out, her hand trembling as she searched the air. Her fingers found the hair at his temple. It was damp with sweat, the skin beneath it burning with fever. For months, she had hated his touch, viewing it as a brand of ownership. But now, as she felt the ragged tremor in his shoulders, she realized the monster had been dismantled. The man who had executed Director O over a glass of scotch was gone, buried under the weight of the life she held in her arms. "Look at him, Seung-Min," Nyah whispered. "Really look at him." She felt him shift, his breathing hitching as he leaned toward the bundle on her chest. "He has your mouth," Seung-Min murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, devastating ache. "And his father's nose. He is everything I am not. He is a beginning." "He is a Yoon," Nyah said, her voice firm. "But he will not be a king of shadows. I won't let him grow up in a house where the windows are made of fear." Seung-Min took a long, shuddering breath. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the baby before finally, tentatively, brushing the infant's tiny, curled fist. The baby made a soft, dreaming sound, a small chirp of contentment that seemed to shatter the last of Seung-Min's iron resolve. "The syndicate is being restructured," Seung-Min said, his forehead pressing back against her knee. "I have signed over the operational control to Sang-ho and the remaining loyalists. The Yoon name will move into logistics, real logistics. No more docks, no more Han family. I am done with the blood, Nyah. I am done with the chair." Nyah froze. "You're leaving the empire." "I'm leaving the cage," he corrected. "There is a house on the southern coast of Jeju. It's surrounded by citrus groves and the sound of the sea. No marble, no polymer glass, just the wind and the light. I want to take you there. Not as a consultant, not as a captive, but as a family." Nyah felt a sob catch in her throat. She thought of the coffee spill, the $10,000 tip, the gold-plated walls, and the terrifying silence of the library. She thought of the man who had waged a one-man war to keep a hallway clear for a baby that wasn't even his by blood, but was his by choice. "You'll have to tell me what the sea looks like," she whispered, her fingers sliding down to cup his cheek. "Every day, you'll have to be my eyes, Seung-Min, because I can't navigate that world alone." "And you," he said, leaning into her palm, "will have to be my soul, because I don't remember how to be a man without you." 2 weeks later, the black sedans did not follow them to the airport. There were no armed guards at the gate, no frantic tactical chatter on the radio. As the private jet leveled off over the Pacific, Nyah sat by the window, the baby sleeping soundly in a bassinet at her feet. Seung-Min sat opposite her. He reached across the small table, his fingers interlacing with hers. He didn't pull. He didn't command. He simply held. "What do you see?" Nyah asked, her sightless eyes facing the window. Seung-Min looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean, the sun setting in a riot of bruised purples and liquid golds. He looked at the woman who had spilled coffee on his life and ended up staining his heart with a color he couldn't erase. "I see the light, Nyah," he whispered, his voice finally finding its peace. "It's orange and gold, and it's hitting the water in a way that makes the whole world look like it's on fire. But it's not burning us, it's just warming us up." Nyah smiled, a genuine, radiant thing that made her unfocused eyes shine. She leaned back into the soft leather seat, the rhythmic hum of the engines replaced by the steady, quiet thrum of a heart that finally had a reason to beat. The waitress and the boss were gone. There was only the sea, the child, and the long, beautiful walk home into the dark together.